No idea. You don't contact each other? Alright. So today we'll be talking about England in the 18th century. Kindly keep in mind that this was the time when France was experiencing winds of change. You had the French Revolution, wherein people spoke about liberty, equality, and fraternity. The emphasis that was given to reason slowly gave way to emphasis on the emotions. It was a clarion call to return to nature, right? So you need to remember these things. So when you're coming to England, it was the time when you have the growth of the middle class. That is, the sensibility of the people were changing because people were slowly becoming richer. The society was becoming richer because of all the industries that were developing, and one reason was colonization. Because of this, many people were able to become richer because they got very cheap resources, raw material from the colonies, which would be converted into refined and finished products in the factories of London and elsewhere in England, right? So England was the hub of all these industrial revolution. For instance, you can talk about textiles. So it was the time when you had the middle class slowly growing in numbers. So with the rise, you also have the reading public also increasing. There was a growth in the number of people who could read. So this led to the development of a reading public, a public that was hungry to read more and more. So you have more writers also coming in. So these are some of the things we have to keep in mind when you're talking about the England of the 18th century. So you have the growth and the rise of the middle class, and then, as mentioned earlier, the French Revolution influenced the society quite a lot, along with the American War of Independence. So the winds of change were all already blowing into the English shores. And then there were these controversial writings on religion. You had many writers who were challenging the dictates of the Catholic Church. So they started saying that you don't have to believe in all that has been told to you or exposed to you by the church and the clergy. You need to question, you need to challenge things. So there were many controversial writings on religion. So this influence of the enlightenment that was happening elsewhere, you find the same thing happening here in England also. So there was something called the rise of the deism. And what is deism? It's directly connected to religious belief. So earlier people believed that you can find God only through revelation, that God's mercy can only reveal God to you, and priests will help you to do that. That was the belief. But now, during this period of enlightenment, the writers started telling people, there were these revolutionaries who started telling people that you can find God through reason and observation rather than through revelation. So you don't have to wait for an angel of God to come and tell you that there is God or there is some divinity around. So you don't need that. So you look around nature, you look at all these things, and you can sense that there is divine in things. So that was the rise of the deism. So this had a direct effect on the way religion was perceived by people. So that all powerful hold that religion had over the society was now on the decline. People started seeing that how the priests were also gullible. Even the priests were guilty of so many things. So things came out in the open. So it was that time wherein church lost its supremacy over the people and their beliefs. And then this age is also known as the age of Johnson. Why? Because he was one of the most prominent writers of the time who wrote quite a lot. He's mainly remembered for his prose works, wherein he speaks about the society, he speaks about the common people. That's why we call this particular age the age of Johnson. The other thinkers who influenced were thinkers like David Hume, Godwin, Adam Smith. Adam Smith the economist, then Edmund Burke. We're already familiar with some of these names when we spoke about the French Revolution. So even for the French Revolution, there were thinkers and influencers who influenced the whole movement from across the seas, that is from England. So some of them were English people. And it was also the time when prose really took off, prose really developed. Please remember, it was also the time when the middle class increased by number. So the middle class had enough money, money as in they had some spare money and spare time to spend in entertainment. So for them, one means of entertainment was reading. So reading public increased. There were more demand for books and writings. So prose was, you could say, the most conducive genre, as in the most conducive way of reaching out to the common reading public, which was mainly middle class in nature. So if you write a lot of poetry or those kind of things, you wouldn't find many takers. So therefore, prose flourished. And it was also the time, and because of the rise of the prose, you had the spirit of polemics, or polemics is actually arguments against something. So when you attack viciously something, so there were these polemical writings against the church, polemical writings against the political beliefs of the days, of the day, wherein they were actually questioning questioning the superiority that was enjoyed by the church, as well as um, the king, the unquestioned, unchallenged authority of the monarchy was now over. So you had more and more people attacking, writing against these things that were supposed to be or that were held as the sacrosanct. So there was the spirit of polemics everywhere. Then you had the rise and spread of journalism. So you had more and more things available. Because, and again, please remember, this was possible because of the rise of the middle class and the rise of this group of people who had the money and the time to read all this. So you had the spread of journalism and the growing popularity of fiction. This is also the time wherein you will find slowly the rise and the development of the novel form. So there was proliferation of periodicals as in magazines that would be published at regular intervals. So some of the famous ones were the Spectator and the Tatler. The Spectator and the Tatler, and then the establishment of the novel as a genre. Again, thanks to the reading public, thanks to the rise of the middle class, and again, because of the rise of the printing press. So, all these things were very conducive to the rise of the prose as a genre. So, novel is also something written in prose. So, the prose form reached its highest point, the highest peak, and you had many writers contributing to the genre. And when you're talking about poetry, this particular time is remembered for neoclassical poetry. So, neoclassical poetry reaches its perfection during this particular time, but towards the end of the 18th century, we can also see how there is a gradual decline. We'll be again now discussing neoclassical poetry in detail and why we call it neoclassical. So, when you're talking about the gradual decline, that is by the end of the 18th century, we need to remember one important landmark, that is the publication of the lyrical ballads by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1798. Please remember the year. This is a landmark year. So, with the publication of this particular tome, this particular book, you have the official inauguration of a new sensibility, wherein you have a slow moving away and moving towards nature, moving towards emotions, sensibility, dream, imagination. Those are the things espoused by this particular book. So, this becomes a landmark. And with this, you have the official inauguration of a new era, a new age of sensibility. Now, looking at neoclassical poetry, we have already seen how neoclassical poetry had reached its peak during this particular time. We call it neoclassical, neo as in new, classical as in they followed or they copied the ways of the classical Greek poetry. which was considered to be the highest point of perfection in writing. Right? So the language was very refined, the ideas were rationalized, and the ideas were versified. So rather than feelings, ideas were versified. So please remember, so here in neoclassical poetry, what is given importance? Ideas form the core of the poetry. So they try to follow the classical form in style. So when you're talking about the form, it was classical in nature. But then the content, what was the subject matter? It was the topical and the contemporary. So the style, structure, words, versification, meters, choice of words, everything was classical. Perfect and refined and measured. But then the topic was topical as in the contemporary and what was happening around in the society during those days. So you have something like, a very interesting example, rape of the lock. What is it about rape of the lock? Alexander Pope, he speaks about how a nobleman, gentleman, had cut off a lock of hair from this lady love Belinda, and then the way she responds to that, actually it's a very silly happening. It's a very silly incident, but then it is blown out of proportion and it is described as if the poet is speaking about a war. You have a language that is highly polished, refined. It makes use of blank verse, all kinds of booming sounds. Even the whole situation is made to look as if it's a battleground. So the treatment of something very topical, sometimes even very silly things are blown and given, you could say, a classical shape or a classical proportion, as if you were talking about the Homer, the Iliad, Odyssey, things that had cosmic significance. In the classical poetry, things had very classical significance. So likewise, in neoclassical poetry, they would take up incidents from the city life, incidents from the daily life, or something, some kind of a scandal, something very funny. They would take that and then develop it like this. And these poems, they also had the impact of science and reason. Then it described and celebrated the city life, the cityscape. The landscape was the city. That is the man about the city, the man of the world. So everything was very elegant and refined. Then again spoke about urban life and rationality. So this was the canvas of neoclassical poetry. The style, diction, everything was classical in nature. But then the topic, the topic matter was about city life, the man of the city, all their elegance, the balls they would have, the kind of discussions they would have, all that would be the topic. And this poet Alexander Pope, who belonged to this particular age, he was considered to be a master of sarcasm, wherein he would make fun of everything, fun of the society, fun of the ways and manners. So you can call him a master over sarcasm. He used iambic couplets. You're familiar with iambic meter, right? So iambic couplet, as in you have two rhyming words with 5 feet each. So he would make use of iambic couplets, and his works were filled with satire, sarcasm, but then with nobility of sentiment. So some example is the Dunciad, the Rape of the Lock, Essay on Man. We've already talked about the Rape of the Lock. And then you have Ben Jonson. We have already seen how this age is also called the age of Johnson, who contributed quite a number of essays and critiques during this particular time. Now, after reaching that perfection in poetry, in neoclassical poetry, we also see that there is a slow move towards a new sensibility, a new way of looking at life. So there's this gradual decline in the neoclassical style of writing. And this new style, you could say, was inaugurated not with only the publication of the lyrical ballads. So there is another writer who comes in between the neoclassical style and the style espoused by lyrical ballads. Somebody in between. So this in between poet and his work is actually a combination, an amalgamation of these two sensibilities or these two worlds, and that is Thomas Gray. Please remember, he is very, very important. He can be seen as a transition poet, poet or a transition point. His work is a transition point from, like when you look at it, you can see that his work espouses, he makes use of both the sensibilities. One is that of reason that was there in classical poetry, and then sentiment that you find in romantic poetry. So his work is elegy written in a country churchyard. This particular poem, it's very famous. This can be seen as a link between the two sensibilities of reason and emotion. So he can be seen as that link. So half of him is neoclassical and half of him is romantic in nature. So slowly you can see that drift, this change towards a new sensibility. So he introduced new elements of melancholy, as in feeling sad and sentimental about things. So elements of melancholy and ruminations. The rumination is wherein you're thinking deeply. Ruminations on the plight of the common people, the rustic people, as in the village folk, who were ignored by the poets of the neoclassical tradition. So when you look at the neoclassical tradition, the poets were mainly worried about, or they thought and wrote only about people in the city. Cityscape, man of the city was their area of interest. Nobody bothered about what was happening in the villages, what was happening to the common rustic people. There was nobody to write about them. So in his poem, you find this poet thinking about the rustic people, the common, ordinary, unsung heroes who live and die in the villages. So the occasion is he has gone to a churchyard. It's a graveyard. And then he's looking at the mounds, the grave mounds of all these rustic people who have died and gone and are buried. So that particular situation becomes the moment for him to reflect upon life, reflect upon the kind of lives these people must have lived. And they died. And then he feels sad for them because nobody has acknowledged their importance. Nobody has given them any importance. Nobody has sung poems and songs about them. Some of them would have been real hero material, but then nobody cared, nobody bothered. So all these people, they simply vanished from the stage of life after having lived their life. Maybe they were not that momentous, but then some of the lives would have been meaningful. They would have contributed something, but then they were deprived of all the facilities, maybe the knowledge that was available to people living in the cities. So he thinks about all these things. So it's a rumination on mortality, it's a rumination on class, it becomes a rumination on the differences that is there between people in the city and people in the um, villages. So the form in which this poem, elegy, it is neoclassical in nature. The form, the structure is neoclassical, but the content is that of the common, ordinary, rural folk. So the content is the poet's affinity. He feels very close to. He has a soft sentiment towards the simple rural people. So, and then the poem becomes an occasion wherein he is bemoaning as in he is feeling sad, he's crying about the deprivations of the rustic. So, he's feeling very sorry for all these people, all these lives that were lived, and the lives that have vanished without being heard of, without being acknowledged by people who matter. You understand? So in here, what do we find? We find a move towards a new sensibility. So Thomas Gray is that link. So part of it, as in the form of the poem, the structure, the choice of words, all that is neoclassical, wherein that there is perfection, meter is perfect, the words are all used in the proper manner. So the form is neoclassical, but then here you have a slow change, a move from the cityscape to the rural and the rustic. So he can be seen as a transitional poet who comes, you could say, in the middle as in that is between the two sensibilities of reason and emotion. And after this, we need to remember the publication of the Lyrical Ballads, 1798. So, with this, you have the official inauguration of a new age, official inauguration of a new sensibility. So, you have a total cutting off and going towards an era which gives a lot of importance to imagination, emotion, sensibility, as in sensitivity, right? So, so you can see from neoclassical, now we slowly have moved towards the romantic. So you have lyrical ballads published in 1798 by William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge. So what are the main things that we find in this book? The first one is you have a call to move to the pure nature, unsullied as in pure nature, towards the rustic. And they say that our mind, human beings' mind, have become pollution by the unnatural ways of the city life. That is, cityscape is unnatural, and that city experience is terrible. So now they are saying that you need to get or move towards nature. You need to experience that spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. That is, as a poet, you need to move away from the city and you need to get back to nature. You have to get back to nature, and then you need to think, reflect, and then that inspiration will come to you. So, what is poetry? Poetry is nothing but a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. We need to remember this particular quote. So, they say that feelings generated by contemplation of scenes from the rural by the primeval innocence. That is, once you are in nature, what do? You look at nature and you contemplate, you think about it. And these scenes are kind of taken into your inner mind. And then you think about it, you ruminate on it, and then it will come back to you. And this is possible if you are in nature, because when you go into nature, that primeval innocence, that earlier innocence that we had when we lived close with nature would come back. So you don't need any empirical testimony, but then the pure human mind talking of the pure in nature. So this is a rejection of the empirical, the scientific, and the rational. So this is a break away. This particular publication is a breaking away from the previous sensibility. So according to them, how is poetry written? Genesis of poetry, as in the beginning, or how poetry is created. This is a meta narrative. Meta narrative, as in a writing about poetry. So according to them, how is poetry written? Poetry is nothing but an interplay of the mind in a state of purity with the wholesome natural environment. That is, you have the mind will be very pure. That is, the mind will become pure when you go into nature. And then after that, what will happen? When you go into nature, that purity comes out, and then this will help you to bring out that creativity. And this creativity is possible because you have experienced something, you have seen something. So that is recollected. So this embodies truth, and from which comes truth. So if you want to get to the root of anything that is true, you need to go to nature. You need to reflect, and it will come back to you. It will inspire you, and with that inspiration, you will be able to write poetry. And for this, you need imagination. So imagination is what? It is nothing but an apprehension of truth, and then it's a casting of a film of strangeness over the familiar. That is, all of us watch daffodils, right? All of us must have seen daffodils or heard about it, whatever. But then we never think beyond that. It's a common ordinary for us. But it took a poet like Wordsworth to write about it, and even today it is considered to be one of the finest nature poems, daffodils. It's so beautiful, right? So even the ordinary can be given that extraordinary appeal by means of imagination. So this imagination works in a manner by giving it a unique charm. So even the simple, common, ordinary are given a unique charm by means of imagination with which a poet is blessed. So, lyrical ballads, in short, is you could say a manifesto of romanticism, a manifesto as in a written testimony, a written testament, which tells people, which tells the other poets actually what is poetry, what should be the topic of poetry, and how poetry should be written. So, we'll be exploring this in detail by taking up two examples from lyrical ballads. One is the very famous poem, The Solitary Reaper by William Wordsworth, and another one, Kubla Khan by S.T. Coleridge. So we'll be examining these two poems in light of these points or these ideas put forward by the writers in Lyrical Ballads, which was published in 1798.